But this morning for Sunday, in fact, for Sunday school, I enjoyed that topic too. But for the Sunday sermon, this is one of my favorite stories in the Bible. I even like this story more than I like the story of David and Goliath. I think this is a very inspiring story. And most people, I believe, know this story, but just in case, this may be new for some people. This is Jonathan starting a battle cry. And the goal of this lesson is to show that every Christian should have a trust in God like Jonathan did for these three reasons. First, Jonathan served a fearful army. Second, Jonathan trusted God regardless of God's decisions. And third, Jonathan inspired a rally cry throughout fearful Israel. And that's my whole sermon, so we can go ahead and go. Now, let's go ahead and break that down a little bit more. Jonathan served a fearful army. This is, again, a great story. We'll start in chapter 13, so I was right on that. Let's go ahead and read verse 2 through 3. 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 2 through 3. And this will be in the King James Version, but you can read it in whatever translation you have. It says, Saul chose him 3,000 men of Israel, whereon 2,000 were with Saul in Michmash and in the Mount Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan in Gibeah of Benjamin. Now, Jonathan was the son of Saul, by the way. And this is early on in Saul's reign as king, and he was still kind of getting people to rally behind him. He was still kind of struggling with it a little bit. It says, and Jonathan smote the garrison of the Philistines that were in Geba, and the Philistines heard of it, and Saul blew the trumpet throughout all the land, saying, let the Hebrews hear. Now the word Hebrew is it's the same name as Israel. It's just two different names for the same thing. Israel, Hebrew, or Hebrews and Israelites are the same thing. So Saul is thinking, okay, sweet, we've won another battle. In fact, Jonathan had won this battle, and he's trying to boost up his army, saying, look at what we're doing, look at how we're defeating the enemies. But guess who also heard about this? The Philistines heard about this, and the Philistines are trying to figure out, okay, one-on-one, we can't defeat them. What can we do to defeat the Israelites? And look at what they do. And the Philistines gathered themselves together to fight with Israel, 30,000 chariots, which means there's a person on every chariot, maybe two people, because sometimes they would have one person driving the chariot and another person with a bow and arrow behind him. And the chariots, they were like the tanks of the Old Testament times, right? So if you had a chariot in battle, it was a pretty big deal. And they had 30,000 chariots. And and 6,000 horsemen. So these were not just the foot soldiers, these were just the people riding on horses, which again were kind of like the tanks, not as big of the tanks as the chariots, but still it was an intimidating thing having someone on a horseback during battle. And people, as the sand which is on the seashore in multitude. In other words, whoever counted this, he counted 30,000 chariots, he counted 6,000 horsemen, and then when he looked at the rest of them, he says, I'm done counting. Right? He's like, I can't even count that high. That's how many people were there. So you can imagine this massive army that had come up against Israel. And after I graduated high school, I initially went to a community college. It was Hutchinson. And I was on the track team there, and I was very gifted with speed, and I always appreciated that God gave me that gift because he didn't give me coordination. I have zero. So I was a decathlete, and so I would usually get points by throwing or running, but when it came to the coordinated ones, I was just nothing. But anyways, my coach, for whatever reason, he thought, you were pretty good at hurdles, which I don't think I was, but I was pretty new to it, so I was still growing, and I was fairly good at it. So he just thought I had a lot of potential. So he kept putting me on the 400-meter hurdles. Ladies and gentlemen, not only did God not give me coordination, he didn't give me any stamina. I would run 100 meters, I'd puke. I'd run 200 meters, I'd puke. They said, what about 400 meters? I said, I can't do it. And eventually, in high school, they did convince me to run the 4x400 meters. And I would just die after the first 300 meters. I'd be like, my legs would feel like tar. I just couldn't do anything. But in college, he was kind of cruel to me. He kept making me run the 400 meters for whatever reason. And this time, it was 400 meters with obstacles, right? So my buddy, his name was Austin. He was not as fast as me. I will hold that. But he had stamina. And so when we would run the 400-meter hurdles, I would be beating him the first 100, the second 100, the third 100, and then my legs would just be like, you're done, right? It would just be like, just tar, right? And he would just kick it into gear, and he would zoom past me. So he would reserve all his energy for the last 100 meters, and he would always pass me, and it always drove me nuts because I'm like, I know I'm faster than you, but you keep beating me that last 100 meters. So one day I decided, all right, I'm going to beat him because no matter how much I paced myself the last 100 meters, I just had no energy. So I said, I'm just going to go all in the first 300 meters. I'm going to be so far in front of him that he's going to think there's no way I can catch up to him. And so that last 100 meters, I'm just going to be on fumes, right? But because he thinks I'm so far in front, he's not going to even try. And sure enough, that first 100 meters, I was crushing him. The second 100 meters, I crushed him. The third 100 meters, I crushed him. And I was so far in front of him, he looked at the distance between us and he said, there's no way I can catch up to him. So he didn't even try. And it probably looked really odd because I was like a snail's pace at that last 10 meters, right? And that's what the Philistines were trying to do to the Israelites. They realized that, hey, for whatever reason, the Israelites seem to be better at fighting than us. But here's the thing, if we overwhelm them, remember Saul had gathered 3,000 people together, and the Philistines, they brought 30,000 chariots, or tanks as we would think of them, and they brought 6,000 horsemen and more people than can be even counted, like grabbing sand from the sea. You just aren't going to count every little grain of sand. And that's the same description that God gave, or the Bible gave, when talking about Gideon's battle. So the Philistines, they're thinking, if we can just overwhelm them with such high numbers, it's going to discourage them so much, they're not even going to try. And ladies and gentlemen, it was working. Look at what it says. When the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait, right? They were in a big problem, for the people were distressed, then the people did hide themselves in caves and in thickets and in rocks and in high places and in pits. And some of the Hebrews went over Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead, right? They hightailed it out of the country. As for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal, and all the people followed him trembling. So this army, which originally was 3,000, they may have gathered a few, or maybe even thousands of more after the original defeat of the Philistines, but now they're all scattered, right? They're hiding in rocks and caves and anywhere they can find. They are hiding from the Philistines because they think we're not even going to try. The distance between us is way too great that they were not even going to try to fight them. And look at this. And Saul numbered the people that were present with him, about 600 men. So it goes from 3,000 now to 600. And again, they may have had more between then, but now they're all running for their lives. And Saul and Jonathan and his sons and the people that were present with them abode in Gibeah of Benjamin, but the Philistines encamped in Michmash. Now there is a story between here. We're going to kind of skip it, but it's an important story, so go back and read it later on. But it's an interaction between Saul and Samuel in which you start to see Saul getting away from the Lord. But fortunately, the Lord was not getting away from Israel. And that's so often true for us. Even when we get away from the Lord does not forget about us. Now, oftentimes there are consequences, but God still loves us. Look at verse 19 through 22. Now there was no smith, talking about a blacksmith, throughout all the land of Israel. For the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make them swords or spears. Right? So the Philistines had such a stronghold in the land of Israel that they got rid of all their blacksmiths. They got rid of all their metal. So now if they had farming instruments like plows and pitchforks and axes, they literally had to go to the Philistines to sharpen their pitchforks. So that's how much of a strong grip of influence the Philistines had over the Israelites at this time. But all the Israelites went down to the Philistines to sharpen every man his share and his coulter and his axe and his mattock. Yet they had a file. The word file here, I had to look it up because I noticed that different translations were translating this differently. The word that was found here is actually a word that wasn't found anywhere else in the Bible. So by the time the King James translators were translating this, Hebrew, by the way, was no longer a spoken language. It had stopped being a spoken language for 1,000 years before the King James Version wrote this. So they were kind of struggling a little bit because here's this word they've never seen before, and it looks similar to the word for tooth. So they're trying to use, I'm speculating. I have not asked them. This was a long time ago. I'm assuming that they were trying to figure out how does the word tooth fit into this context. And they probably thought, okay, maybe like teeth on a file. So they could file their equipment, try to sharpen it with a file, right? But later on, archaeologists, they did find an artifact that had the word on it, and the word in that context actually referred to 2/3 of a shekel. So newer translations, they won't translate it as a file, but rather they'll translate it as they had to pay 2/3 of a shekel to sharpen their instruments, which was a lot of money back then. So not only do they have to go to the Philistines to sharpen their instruments, which they were going to use against the Philistines, but their weapons are inferior, made of things like stone and wood and stuff like that, whereas the Philistines are filled with swords and spears, and yet the Israelites, they have to go to their enemies and say, hey, can you sharpen my axe? And they're like, well, we'll sharpen it, but you're going to have to pay a hefty price for it. So anyways, let's see. So it came to pass in the day of battle that there was neither sword nor spear found in the hand of any of the people that were with Saul and Jonathan, but with Saul and with Jonathan his son was there found. So in other words, there were only 2 people out of all these 600 men who had a sword, and that was Saul and his son Jonathan, the prince of Israel. No one else even had a sword. They had these inferior weapons like a pitchfork and things like that. So you can imagine the fear of Israel going into this battle thinking, there are so many of them, our weapons are inferior, we are inferior, and there's a huge amount of fear going on in the land of Israel. But Jonathan trusted God, and listen to this, regardless of God's decision. Now let's see how he does this. Now it came to pass upon a day that Jonathan the son of Saul said unto the young man that bare his armor. Now, because Saul and Jonathan were the only ones with swords, it seems as though he has someone who was going to hold his armor, hold a shield, for example. So this was likely someone who would stand behind him, and as the enemy went to go strike him, he would block for Jonathan. So Jonathan could just focus on swinging the sword, and maybe he would guard his back. So Jonathan says to this armor bearer, this shield bearer, let's see, come and let us go over to the Philistines' garrison that is on the other side. But he told not his father. So Jonathan, for whatever reason, he doesn't tell the king that, hey, I'm going to go over to the Philistines, and we'll see why in a second. In verse 6 through 7 of chapter 14, and Jonathan said to the young man that bare his armor, come and let us go over into the garrison of these uncircumcised. Now Jonathan didn't care about their anatomy. The statement of uncircumcised, it was kind of a way of saying these heathens, right? These godless, or at least not the fearers of our God. It may be, that's right, emphasis there, that the Lord will work for us, for there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. Now this is something that I think is huge, because Jonathan is saying not to the 600 men, he's not trying to get them pumped for this battle. He says to one person, he says, hey, let's go over and fight the Philistines. Maybe God will deliver them into our hands. And you'd think, this guy's nuts. I don't want to follow that guy. But listen to his logic. He says the Lord doesn't need a lot of people, right? And maybe he had read the stories of Gideon and things like that. But for whatever reason, he has so much faith in God that he says, the numbers don't matter to God. If God wants to deliver them into our hands, he'll deliver them. If he doesn't, he won't, right? He had so much faith in God that he was willing to put his life, and his armor bearer, by the way, is also willing to put his life into the hands of Jonathan's plan. And his armor bearer said unto him, do all that is in thine heart. Turn thee. Behold, I am with thee according to thy heart. So the armor bearer, he's saying, I'll do whatever your plan is, I'm for it. And this is just an evidence that Jonathan had this power of influence, this way of inspiring people to follow him, even into suicide missions, because of the faith that he held in God. Then said Jonathan, behold, we will pass over unto the men, and we will discover ourselves unto them. This guy's nuts. Right? What's the point? You think, okay, well, we're going to go surprise attack them. And Jonathan's like, no. We're going to make sure they know we're there, right? We're going to give away the element of surprise and make sure they know we're there. If they say thus unto us, tarry until we come to you, then we will stand still in our place, and we will not go up unto them. Now, Jonathan and his armor bearer, they're going to have to kind of climb up a little bit of a mountain or an elevated area in order to get to the Philistine garrison. And so what they're saying is, we're going to be down here. They're going to be around a campfire doing whatever they're doing. And we're going to call out to them and say, hey, we're down here. And they're going to be like, hey. And Jonathan says, if they say, stay there, we'll come to you. Jonathan says, we're going to surrender, right? Which still sounds like a nuts plan, right? Because I know if you guys have seen Star Wars and you see the Revenge of the Sith, Obi-Wan's like, don't try it, Anakin. I've got the high ground, right? But in reality, if you're trying to climb down a mountain, the person with the sword at the bottom, swipe, there goes your feet, right? Having the high ground in this case was not a benefit. So as they're climbing down, Jonathan and his armor bearer, they could just start swiping feet, right? But Jonathan says, no, if they say, we'll come down to you, which would have been more difficult for them, would have been easier for Jonathan to take them out. Jonathan says, if they say that, we're just going to surrender. That sounds like a nuts plan, right? And listen to this. And we will not go up unto them. But if they say thus, come up unto us, then we will go up, for the Lord has delivered them into our hands, and this shall be a sign unto us. So again, his new plan is, or his plan is, if they say, we'll come down to you, which puts them at the disadvantage, he says, we'll just surrender. But if they say, come up to us, now as Jonathan and his armor bearer climbing up, all it would take is for them to swing their swords and cut off their heads. So Jonathan's saying, if they say to do that, we'll know that God's with us. And Jonathan had this trust in God, and this was supposed to be a sign to him, because he said that this would be such an irrational way of doing it that he thought only God would set up the situation to work out this way. So Jonathan had so much faith in God that he was willing to test God in order to see, will God deliver them into our hands, which he believed God could. And he says, and if he does, this will be the sign. And ladies and gentlemen, I have a faith in God that says I believe God can do anything, right? I believe the things that are impossible for us are not impossible for God. I hate to compare myself to Jonathan, but I believe that God can deliver from a few or from many. Doesn't even matter. The problem that I often have, the struggle that I have, is not distrusting God's power, but sometimes distrusting God's will. You know what I mean? And I know that sounds terrible, because it's not that I believe he can't save me, for example, like save me from a problem. It's that I don't always know if he will save me from the problem, because sometimes his plans are not always our plans. And Jonathan is here saying it doesn't matter, right? If God doesn't do it my way, doesn't matter. I'm going to stand here and I'm going to surrender to God's plan. And this has always been a struggle for me. Many of you know that I've wanted to go on the mission field for decades at this point. And for a long time, I wasn't planning on getting married. And I've told this story before because I thought, I'm gonna go to a dangerous place where I may have to run for my life, and I don't want to have a family there who's going to be holding me back when I may have to run. And I remember Micah, Pastor Micah now, he was from our church. He's a pastor in Emporia now. But when he was going to Bible college, he and we were good friends. And he told me, he said, Daniel, I've noticed that all the men going to be pastors in my Bible college are really buff and athletic. He said, I wonder if God's preparing the next generation of pastors, helping them to be more athletic, more agile, because he knows there's a battle coming. Not necessarily one where we beat everyone up, but one where we may be running for our lives, we may be hiding. He says, I wonder if God's preparing the next generation for that. And I hope that's not true, but the Lord knows what he's going to do, and we can trust him with that. But I remember thinking, I said, maybe that's why God gave me such speed and such strength, because he knew I was going to be in situations where I had to run or I had to fight back. because there are countries out there where they're very hostile if you share the gospel with them. They'll torture you, they'll kill you. And I just thought, okay, well, maybe God wants me to go to those places because he's prepared me for that. And then God brought Lily into my life. Oh, my goodness. I love her, but we're going to die. It doesn't matter how fast I am. That woman's going to be the death of me. I mean, I'll be walking at a normal pace, and she'll be like, wait for me. And I'm just thinking, I'm like, that's the last thing I'm going to see before I die. So now I'm in a little bit of a perplex or a complicated situation because I trust that God can help me out of a situation, but do I trust that God will help my wife out of a situation? Now, I know God likes her probably more than me, but the thing is, it's one thing to put my life on the line. It's another thing to put my wife's life on the line. And so it's a struggle for me even to this day, and please pray for me that God would give me a heart that doesn't like Lily anymore. No, I'm kidding. Pray that God would give me a heart that says, trust me, I can, but even if I don't, because that's the hard part. I know he can, but will I trust him even if he doesn't? So please pray for me, because I want to have the faith that Jonathan has, and Jonathan didn't bring his wife, right? But anyways, it's a struggle because we don't have kids yet, but if the Lord gives us children in the future, can I still go to a dangerous place knowing that I'm bringing my wife and my children? Will I trust God to protect them, and even if he doesn't, still trust him? And anyways, please pray for me on that. But Jonathan had this attitude that regardless of what God chooses, he's just going to surrender to God's will. So anyways, let's see what happens. And both of them discovered themselves into the garrison of the Philistines. And the Philistines said, behold, the Hebrews come forth out of the holes where they had hid themselves, right? They're making fun of the Israelites. And the men of the garrison answered Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, come up to us, and we will show thee a thing, right? We'll teach you a lesson. And Jonathan said unto his armor bearer, sweet, come up after me, for the Lord hath delivered them into the hands of Israel. Now, the Philistines were probably a little confused by why he was so excited. But for Jonathan, he thought, this is exactly what we were looking for. God has delivered them into our hands before it even happened. I remember I was hearing the story of a missionary, and this missionary was talking about tithing. And he was trying to explain to his church, it was in, I think it was Indonesia, and he was trying to explain to them that, hey, you know, God deserves the first fruit, right? The first 10% we should give to the Lord. And the next day, a kid shows up, and he hands the pastor a fish. And he says, here's my tithe. And he said, oh, one fish? He said, where's the other 9 fish? He says, I haven't caught them yet, right? It's this idea that he had so much faith, this boy had so much faith that God was going to provide the other 9 because he was faithful with the one. He gave it back to the Lord. And Jonathan, before God has even fought for him, he sees it and he says, God has already won this battle, right? The Lord has already delivered them into our hands. And he fights with that conviction, knowing that God has already won the battle. It's just up to him to swing his sword a couple times, or not a couple times. This would have been an exhausting battle. And Jonathan climbed up upon his hands and upon his feet, right? This wasn't a nice path. He's climbing, right? It was a very disadvantaged battle. Upon his hands and upon his feet, and his armor bearer after him. And they fell before Jonathan, the enemies, right? They're being killed before Jonathan. And his armor bearer slew after him. And that first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men within, as it were, a half an acre of land, which a yoke or an oxen might plow. So in other words, they're over here underestimating Jonathan and his armor bearer. And he climbs up there and he takes out his sword and whack, 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 and they can't stop him. They start running for their lives. They're thinking, all of us have not been able to stop this person. He's already killed 20 of us, and they're running for their lives against Jonathan and his armor bearer. Listen to this. And there was trembling in the host, right? This garrison, which was likely more than 20 people, but he had already killed 20 of them, are running for their lives back to the camp, screaming. And the people, the entire army is like, what's going on? They're trembling in the field and among all the people, the garrison and the spoilers, they also trembled. And look at this. And the earth quaked. I always, reading this in the past, I always assumed that it was talking about their fear was so big that the earth felt like it was shaking. But in reality, what the chances are what's really happening is God is shaking the mountains, right? You've heard Jesus say that if you just have enough faith, you can move mountains. Well, that's what literally was happening. God was shaking the mountains, shaking the battlefield that the enemy was on, emphasizing to them that the battle was already lost for them. Not only were they running in terror of 2 people, but now the God of Israel is behind them, adding to their trembling, and they're freaked out by this. Now, Jonathan inspired a rally cry throughout fearful Israel. It says, and the watchmen of Saul and Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude melted away, right, all the way from the other camp, which would have been pretty far away. They're looking, they're hearing this trembling, they're hearing this crying out. They're looking as the army is melting away, they're spreading out, they're running for their lives, and they're thinking, what's going on? Then said Saul unto the people that were with them, number now and see who is gone from us, right? Who's doing this? And when they had numbered, behold, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. So now Saul is starting to realize that, hey, Jonathan, my son, he's the one causing this battle cry to happen. Israel is going to start rallying behind Jonathan. And Saul and all the people that were with him assembled themselves, and they came to the battle. And behold, every man's sword was against his fellow. In other words, they get to the battle and they're like, what's going on? They're killing each other, right? There's so much confusion. There's so much trembling going on. They're starting to fight each other. And we see a very similar story with the story of Gideon, right? Remember when Gideon was instructed to go into the battle and they had torches. It was at night and they broke pots and the enemy started whacking each other off, right? They were starting to kill each other out of confusion. But part of the confusion we'll talk about in a second. It says, moreover, the Hebrews that were with the Philistines before that time, so in other words, there were Israelites who had betrayed Israel. They had treasonously left Israel and joined the enemy army. They were traitors to Israel. And now look at what happens to them. Philistines before that time, which went up with them into the camp from the country round about, even they also turned to be with the Israelites that were with Saul and Jonathan. So in other words, these traitors who were so confident that the Philistines were going to win, that they left the Israelites and joined the Philistines, now they're seeing the tide starting to turn. They're seeing God working. They're seeing the faith of Jonathan causing all this fear and this trembling, and they decide we're going to join God's side again. So they start fighting the Philistines, and they're dressed in their uniform. It's causing all sorts of confusion, and God is using all this to defeat the enemy before the Israelite army even got there. They're seeing all of this unfold. Likewise, all the men of Israel which had hidden themselves in Mount Ephraim, when they heard that the Philistines fled, even they also followed hard after them in the battle. So in other words, the people who, not just the traitors who joined the Philistine side, but even the people who were hiding in caves, they start hearing the fear and the trembling of the enemy, and they're thinking, what's going on? And they come out and they see this battle, and they think, we want to join this battle. So because of the faith of one man, the faith of Jonathan, look at this. It doesn't say Jonathan gained victory that day. It says, so the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle passed over unto Bethaven. In other words, thousands of years later, we look at this story and we don't say, wow, Jonathan was a great warrior. We say, wow, Jonathan served a great God, right? The same God that we serve. And we can have the confidence and the faith that Jonathan had that says, hey, God can do this regardless of our resources, right? Regardless of who helps us or anything like that. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, I would do that, but I don't have enough money, or I don't have enough influence, or I don't have enough, whatever it might be, whatever the circumstance is. And you have to remember what Jonathan says. The Lord doesn't care about these external factors. The only thing that matters when trying to figure out if you can do something is if God is behind you, because God doesn't need anything else. He just wants your faithfulness. All right, so the Lord saved Israel that day, all because Jonathan had the faith and was able to, had the wisdom to trust God in the middle of this. And I wonder how different history would have been if Israel had just fled, if Jonathan had just followed his father into exile or hiding or into captivity of the Philistines, how much history would have been changed. But because one man stood up, mountains were moved, wars were fought, a war that was so large. I have to assume that the Philistines, which we talked about in Sunday school this morning, they had 5 different kind of nations, if you will, 5 different kings or lords, and they were probably all gathered together, trying to unite together to try to discourage the Israelites, right? To look so big that there was no way Israel could take them down. But yet God was bigger than the Philistine army. And as Jonathan said, it didn't matter how many people he used, he could do it with even a few. So the question, I may have bumped it. Anyways, we're to the conclusion. The next part is the conclusion. Every Christian should have the faith in God that Jonathan had. Not a faith that says, I believe he can. I think that's faith, right? I believe that that's faith. But a faith that says, even if he doesn't, I'm still going to trust him. And Jonathan had that faith, and it inspired his armor bearer, a man who was like, not, I'll go with the 600. He says, I'll go with the 1 into this battle. And after Jonathan gave him his nuts plan, right, this plan that says, hey, let's put ourselves at as much of a disadvantage as we can and see if God delivers them. And now because he did that, there was no question in Jonathan's mind, there was no question in his armor bearer's mind that God was behind this situation, that God was the one who delivered Israel. And you might be thinking to yourself, what would God have us to do, or you to do, or me to do? And you might think, well, let's be reasonable. Jonathan wasn't reasonable. The man was nuts, right? He was a cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. The man had such an unreasonable plan, anyone with 2 cells of a brain would say, that's terrible, let's not do that. He chose an unreasonable plan to test God, and God proved himself to not just Jonathan, but to all of Israel. So when you're thinking about what is God's plan for me? What does God want me to do? Don't think about what you can do. Think about what God can do and see if you can partner with that. In other words, let's say Verl and Elda, which you guys are wonderful people. Let's say God called them to be missionaries to Africa. And let's say they said, well, we can't do that because we're too experienced, right? we're too experienced in age. But Jonathan would say, doesn't matter. Let's say God called Steve and said, Steve, I want you to go into the ministry. And Steve said, well, you know, I've got all these responsibilities. I've got to do this. I've got to do that. And Jonathan would say, doesn't matter. What if God called all different people in this room to do something big, something you think you can't even do? And you might say, well, I can't do that. But that's the point. God can do that, and God can use you in such mighty ways, and no matter what excuse you can come up with, there's no circumstance that matters in any situation except this one circumstance. Is God for it? If God is for it, he will bring it to pass. So again, if you're thinking, well, God, I think God may be calling me to quit my job, you might say, well, I can't do that. God can provide you a better job, and maybe he doesn't provide you a better job. Maybe he provides you a much worse job. Maybe I don't want to pick and choose what jobs are worse than others, but maybe he provides you a terrible job, and you think, this I must have misread that situation. But maybe there's someone at that terrible job who who has never heard the gospel, or God has brought you into their life for that very reason. If one man was able to shake mountains, if one man was able to start a rally cry because of the faith that he had, to where he was able, through God's help, to defeat an army that cannot even be counted, what could God do with an entire church full of people with that much faith? He could impact not just the city of Cheney, not just the city of Wichita or Kingman or Garden Plain or Andale or all these surrounding cities. He could impact the state. He could impact the nation. He could impact the world if every single person in this room had the faith that Jonathan had, a faith that can move mountains. Now, as I admitted earlier, I'm struggling with that faith. And I would care to guess that most people are struggling with that. It's not that I don't believe God can. It's just sometimes I question if his will aligns with my will. Isn't that stupid, right? We're over here acting like we know something. I remember I'm allergic to bees, and that's not super important to the story, but there was a bee, and it was inside the pool of my parents. This was when I was a kid, and I'm a pretty sensitive kid. I like helping things and people, but this bee was drowning in the water, and I go to grab this bee to let him out, and he stings me. And to this bee, I'm a predator trying to hurt him, but I'm thinking to myself, if only he understood. But guess what? Bees aren't very smart. And I wonder if God looks at us and he says, hey, Daniel, I want you to go to this random hostile place or whatever it might be and preach the gospel. And I think to myself, I don't think so, Lord. That doesn't seem like a good plan. And God's just thinking, if only you knew my plan, if only you understood me, you'd understand that this is a great plan, right? I'm doing something mighty through you. And ladies and gentlemen, there are so many opportunities that we miss. There was someone in our church, I won't mention their name, but they were on the men's group in the WhatsApp, and they were talking about a friend of theirs who unfortunately is passing away of, I think it's terminal cancer. And he's asking prayer for the wisdom and the strength to go to his friend and talk to him about Jesus. And he mentioned, he said, there's been so many opportunities that I've not done it. And he recognizes that God's been working in his life trying to get him to talk to this person. And so often we resist the Lord for whatever reason, shyness, don't want to look weird to our friends, whatever it might be. And we resist God, and God's just looking at us like we're dumb bees. And he's saying, if only you knew what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to do something great. So ladies and gentlemen, that's my lesson to you guys. I shouldn't say that's my lesson. That's God's lesson in his word to us. God can do great things to those who have faith. He may not shake mountains like he did for Jonathan. He may not defeat an entire army like he did with Jonathan, but he's going to do something mighty. If you surrender your life to his will, and like Jesus did, right? Jesus surrendered his will to God's will, and look at what happened. He saved not Israel, he saved the entire world from the condemnation of sin, all because he said, not my will, but thine be done. So let's go ahead and pray. Dear Lord, I love this story because it's something that we can strive for. A faith that says, not my will, but thine be done. A faith that says, even if you don't do what I want you to do, I'm still going to trust you. Lord, I pray that each of us would grow in our faith to where we can have that same kind of courage, that same kind of confidence in you, Lord. Lord, I pray for the times that we miss those opportunities. Lord, I can only imagine how silly we would feel when we get to heaven, and if you were to open up the books and show all the opportunities that we had to share the gospel or to do great things for you, and we look at those things and say, oh, what silly excuses we had, what silly reasons we had for disobeying the God who created us, the God who is all-knowing, the God who is all-powerful, the God who can do anything. And yet we justified our decisions because we thought with our abilities, not your abilities. Lord, I pray that you would grow each of us. Lord, we love you, we praise you, we thank you. In Jesus' name.